Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry we're running just a couple minutes late. I wanted to just come up and welcome everybody to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm Warren Doctor. I'm the CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. Thank you all so much for coming out. Before we kick things off, I just want to tell you about some upcoming events we're going to have. On August 19th, we're hosting the History Hootenanny, which is an open house where everyone can come and experience the museum. It's free to the public. And we're also going to have shuttles that go out to the historic homes, so over to Blunt Mansion and Mabry Hazen houses, places like that. So I'd just like to encourage everybody to come if you can and just check out what we're about. We're going to have lots of affiliates from across the region here in the auditorium, and it's just going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have some musicians. We're very excited about it. Also, the next brown bag that we have will be at this same time on August 30th by Marilyn Mascaro, and it's called When the Rivers Flowed, an ambitious hillbilly and Southern flapper discovered Knoxville. So it'll be a really interesting talk. We're very excited about that. But without further ado, I'm going to turn over to our Vice President, Hubert Smith, who will tell you a little bit more about our speaker today.
Keep talking, Morgan.
Okay. I'm now holding space for Hubert. So this is a good opportunity for me to display my Type 5. I'm going to work on my stand-up routine. Is everything okay, Ken? What's happening?
The computer shut out for a minute, but it's back on.
It's because I stepped on the cord. That's what happened there. Sorry, everybody. Hubert?
Thank you.
After you. Thank you.
Shall I proceed, Ken?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As Warren said, I'm Hubert Smith. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Knoxville area of the East Tennessee Historical Society. And by the way, is everybody here a member? Yes? If you're not, please stop by the gift shop there and they'll give you one of these brochures, and you can learn more about all the great things we do here, including the events that Warren spoke about. Glad to see everybody here today, and also some familiar faces. So I won't forget, I just happened to see Bob Booker and Jack Neely in the house. We just happen to have a reading room named after these two great historians. So Jack, raise your hand in case people don't know. Bob, raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you. And Paul also from the historical. Thank you, Paul. Georgiana Vines is here. Her father was the superintendent of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. When was it, Georgiana?
1963 through 69.
Thank you. And his name was?
George Fry.
George Fry. Thank you, Georgiana. Good to have you here today. So, I had something I was going to say, but I've just lost it. So let's just get to what I had planned to say. Well, that's what happens when you try to depend on these things, right? Okay, that's why I write things down. For 17 years, Antoine Fletcher, I'm talking about our presenter today, Antoine Fletcher has been a devoted employee of the National Park Service. He has worked at parks such as Fort Sumter National Monument, Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park, for those of us old enough to remember as Lyndon Baines Johnson, and now the world-renowned Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He's contributed to the National Park Service through interpretation and education, partnerships, and currently he is the science communication at the Appalachian Highland Science Learning Center. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and currently resides in Nashville, North Carolina. So do we call you Ranger Fletcher? Is that the? Thank you. Antoine Fletcher from the National Park Service. Welcome, Antoine.
That was a really good intro. I feel really good. And it's funny, we're at a concert, before we get started, we're at a concert with a gentleman by the name of Trey Wellington, and he's from North Carolina and Tennessee, and we had a concert on Saturday, and we're up there, we're trying to figure out why the speaker system keeps going out. And it was because the banjoist was stumping his feet. And so that's kind of what happens with technology. Wonderful intro. I'm delighted to be here today. As you said, I reside in Asheville, North Carolina, but I was saying earlier, in my college days, I used to come up here and tailgate and all that other good stuff. Right now, not only am I the science communicator, but I also work for the Pacific Northwest Regional Office as a digital media specialist and interpreter. So this will be my third region that I'm working in. But the Smokies has always been home for me. I'm from Northeast Alabama. I grew up coming to the Smokies, hiked Mount LeConte. I never did it again. Never will. When I was 27, so 10 years later, I'm still in love with this place. Before we get started, when I started in the National Park Service almost 18 years ago, I've always been infatuated by the cemeteries, the history that it can tell. And I've also been infatuated with what it doesn't tell us, and how myself as an anthropologist, I have to dig a little deeper. When I started with the Smokies in 2020, one of my jobs was to be over the African American Experiences Project. And we had done extensive research on so many different topics. And we would run into, roadblocks here and there, and we'll keep researching. But what I really, really loved was the cemeteries. And there's a couple of reasons why. For you, most of us have been to the Smokies. But when it comes to cemeteries or life or death, doesn't matter color, socioeconomics, or any of those things. In the Smokies, it was very similar because the Smokies was its own world, so to speak. And the other reason that I really fell in love with not only this project, but cemeteries as well, is because I spent a little bit of time living in Charleston, South Carolina. And I lived in Sullivan's Island. I don't know if you all are aware of Sullivan's Island, but Sullivan's Island was beautiful. I lived under the black and white 1890 or so lighthouse that most people can see from afar. A lot of people saying, wow, government paid for that. I didn't pay for that. So I lived on the beach, but I remember, you would see, all these beautiful homes and historic structures from 1890s, and then, American Revolution, Civil War, and things such as that nature. But tucked in the corner of Sullivan's Island, which most people don't see, just adjacent to this small gas station, is this little cemetery. Many people drive by it. They don't even think about it. Many people never talk about it when they leave the beach, but it always, when I was riding my little beach cruiser, it always caught my eye. And that cemetery was the home of enslaved people, Gullah Geechee culture people that was there for hundreds of years. Some of these people even fought in the American Revolution. And I remember asking different people about it, and they said, yeah, I think this and that and the third. But then I started thinking, I started doing a little bit of my own research and finding out that, these people were cooks and servants, but they also had families and things such as that nature. They created memories there on the island, memories that was handed down. And so when I thought about that, and I think about this project, there, the times I've been in Boston or New York and went to cemeteries, which is kind of more of it. I always think about how I could be the one to tell those stories. So today, this program, If They Could Speak, is speaking to that. Not only myself, but the people here today and, at home, to be the voice of the people in these cemeteries. In the Smokies, we have about 150 registered cemeteries, 156. And for some of them, they don't have names on the tombstones or anything like that. And especially for the cemeteries of Black burials, there's even less than that. So today, I just want to be the voice for that. And you all can help me get there. And so we can get started. So the Smokies is a beautiful place. And most of us in this crowd and at home today, we go to the Smokies for the biodiversity, how beautiful it is. It's just magical place of salamanders and black bears and now elk that run towards your car sometimes. But in between that, you have history, the Historical Society today. And, our superintendent Cash has been really pushing to tell more of the story when it comes to history. And, Rather it's the Eastern Band of Cherokee, early settlers, or African Americans, all of that history adds value to the park. And so we're going to be diving a little bit more into that history when it comes to African Americans. Now, when we first took on this project, we wanted to kind of hone in on where did enslavement start in the Smokies. So we have a lot of things called environmental assessments, surveys, 300-page documents that we go through as, historians or anthropologists. And usually when I go through these documents, there's literally maybe 2 pages or a paragraph when it comes to African Americans. And so we started kind of digging and seeing what is the story. And what we've learned is that many of the enslaved people that's buried in the Smokies today came from West Africa or Guinea, a little small town on the coast. And we've also done extensive research to say possibly there were even African Americans or Africans at the time when Hernando de Soto's expedition came to America in those 1540 ranges, especially in the Carolinas. But also we've learned that the reason why we weren't finding as much information on enslaved people is because the plantations were so small in the Smokies. And so by county, you may see 80 enslaved people in a county, whether that's Jackson County or so on. Larger numbers in Knox County or Asheville and things such as that nature. And so what we found out is that these enslaved people were, forced into bondage, made a 90-day journey over into America, and then they were sold into markets such as Charleston, South Carolina, Memphis, Tennessee, and then they made the long journey here. Now, just imagine that journey. I think about it, even coming to Knoxville today, it's so different than Asheville. Totally different place, in a good way, right? So I had to get my bearings right, and the security guards, I was trying to wave you down so you can come park. And I think that's small with a GPS in 2023. Just imagine making that long voyage of 90 days and then walking all the way to the Smokies and going from a coastal culture to this mountain culture. And that also led to the plantations being, roughly 12 acres or so, where apples and livestock was kind of that main thing that enslaved people did. But the one thing about the Smokies, and like I told you all before, as we look at this picture here, there's 2 pictures here of different grave sites. One on the left is Little Greenbrier Cemetery, which some of you may be familiar with. And the one on the right is the enslaved cemetery. Both cemeteries have been around quite some time. You can kind of notice a couple of differences with these headstones. And I usually interact with the crowd, so I'll kind of do a little bit of it right now. On that left with this Peggy Hicks headstone, what do you all notice? Does anyone just want to take a stab at what do you see on that headstone? You can raise your hand and kind of yell out.
Names and dates.
Names and dates. Okay, and then on the right headstone here with the coin, what do you notice? Not much at all, right? This is pretty common in the Smokies, rather black or white, but usually with black burials, you see a lot less. What you're seeing is something called a field or a headstone that's used as a marker. Now, you could see that with both white and black burials, but what you will see also with early white settlers that lived in the Smokies for quite some time as they had family members to come back and kind of put that story together, where these like enslaved burials, you don't see that much.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
On the right, it doesn't even look like they were buried. There's a mound. Why the mound?
Why the mound? Yeah, we can actually tackle that right now. So the enslaved cemetery is a very unique cemetery. It's one of the few cemeteries that has a mound or mounds. And the burials are not under the mounds, actually. What has happened is sometime between 1860 and 2019, maybe, someone came in and I would say 2019, maybe maybe 2000, someone came in, and as these graves were shifting, they mounded the dirt. So actually the impressions or the indentions between the graves, which we'll see a little closer here in a second, is actually where the graves are. That's where the people are buried. The mounds are just where they actually, when the grave collapsed, they took the soil and moved it to the side. So it's actually a unique thing that you see. Also the coin, we can get into that in a second, but it's unique too. Talking a little bit about the preservations of cemeteries. So the Smokies is very unique in that people lived there for quite some time, as we know. There were homes in places like Elkmont all the way into the late 1900s, where the Park Service began to obtain land over time. But the thing about this, because of that, Horace Albright, which was a director at the time, believed that we should preserve places like the Smokies. It's that history that's still living. And so since the beginning of the park, they've always looked into preserving these cemeteries. And it went back and forth about the interpretation of preservation. Superintendent J.R. Eakin in the 1930s believed that we should kind of preserve the cemeteries, interpret them a little bit, but do a little bit of maintenance to them, not much. And the gentleman that used to do this maintenance was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. And so what happened was 1940s come around, we have World War II, and the CCC, all of these men that was preserving, protecting, really doing things for these cemeteries, actually had to go to war. And the cemeteries were kind of forgotten about for quite some time. And then the acting director, Demeray, actually stated that interments may continue to be made in family burial plots so that the persons may have relatives or friends buried in the cemeteries, but to avoid, if possible, enlargement of the present areas devoted to cemetery use. And so what happened was we didn't want to enlarge the plots in the Smokies as family members passed away. However, we did come up with something called Decorations Day. Have anyone ever heard of Decorations Day? So now families can come to the Smokies since 1978, and they can actually decorate the gravesite. They can put flowers on the gravesite and so on. And so since that time, families have been coming to the Smokies, but also our trail crews do the maintenance on those cemeteries. But then I have to ask people, what happens with the Black burials or the enslaved cemeteries? Because a lot of times when I even started this project, I would get the question of, did Black people even live in Appalachia? Yeah. I grew up in the foothills of Appalachia, right? And so you'll get these questions from people. But what happened was a migration in the 1840s that a lot of people started moving to Liberia. Free people of color moved to the cities, Midwest, places like Chicago for work. And this is Lewis Oates that was telling us this story about how many of his family members moved to Chicago and Ohio for work. And so when you think about those grave sites in the Smokies or around Appalachia, who takes care of those Black grave sites? And so we'll just kind of skip this a little bit. And so as we were doing our research years ago, we were trying to figure out how many cemeteries do we have Black burials in. And so we have a couple throughout the park, which is the Kerr Family Cemetery, the Enlow Mingus Slave Cemetery. We also have one, the Meigs Mountain Cemetery, Higdon and Ravensford, where we have African Americans buried there, or it's exclusively an African American cemetery. So 5 out of the 156. That doesn't mean that there's not more. The Smokies is a vast place of 800, square miles. So there could be more if we can find them. So let's get into burial customs before we actually get into the story. So again, the burial customs there were really similar between Black, white, and Cherokee. Does anyone want to say why in the Smokies was that so similar? I can go living in Asheville, you can kind of see the difference from time to time. But why in the Smokies whether enslaved or free or white or Cherokee, were these burial customs kind of the same?
Mixing.
Mixing?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
right, yeah.
You can go on. Yeah, keep going. Yeah. Kind of expound on that. So
They
mixing.
were intermarrying, maybe.
Intermarrying? Does anyone else?
If areas were close
Yeah.
to each other.
Close to each other? Anyone else?
Lack of resources.
Lack of resources? Yep. Anyone else? There's a lot of this that's true. We have found evidence of interracial marriages or relationships, lack of resources as well. So I'll just paint a picture for you. Although the Smokies seem kind of close, think about going in the Smokies without a car today and just using a horse and buggy or just walking. It will take you forever to get from Tennessee to North Carolina or from the Conalucky Visitor Center to Sugarlands, right? However, because of that remoteness, there was a lack of resources where they couldn't just bring in this large stone that you see, these big stones with the beautiful inscriptions. So the head and the foot stones that we'll talk about is what they used a lot. So they could just go in the field, bring one of those stones in. The problem with that is after a while, when you're hiking through the Smokies, someone like me or you, we don't know what that is, right? So we could stumble upon some of those footstones and not even know that we're in a burial site. Now, I have a little bit of a trained eye, and our archaeologists do as well, but it's still pretty tough. So, what we have seen with cemeteries throughout the park is how they utilize the land. So if you've ever been to the Smokies, you might notice that our cemeteries are usually in an open area. So if you're hiking, you may see trees, open area. Also, you may see an east to west orientation with the grave sites. Does anyone know why? You're shaking your head. I know you.
Praise have to go to Jesus.
Yeah. So you had that when you're thinking about Christianity. So you had that in it as well. Also, sometimes with early white settler burials, you may have more names and symbols, epitaphs, and things like that. And with that, you can kind of learn their story a little bit. And so, say, for instance, an example could be if you had an early white settler burial, if you had a child that died on this date, lived for one day, and you had a mother that died the same date, you probably could make the connection that she died during childbirth. With the enslaved cemeteries, you don't really have that. Black burials, you don't have that at all. We'll get into what you do have in a second. And also, a lot of times with these sites that we have, these burial customs, the locals would make the caskets. So there's a lot of pine caskets that we usually don't tell groups about, but pine caskets that was actually used. A lot of times people were buried in shallow graves about 2 feet because of clay soil as well. Did they leave anything behind? Well, a lot of objects were made out of wood. So any kind of spoons or anything that was left behind wouldn't be here anymore. We do know in certain cases, these cemeteries could have had wooden fences around them. And so that's no longer here. And some of the markers, possibly for enslaved people and also early settlers, could have been cedar crosses that's no longer here as well. In very morbid cases, you may have a family, a baby could be born and they plant a tree on the property, and that tree will be used 60 years later when that person dies to make their casket. So, they utilize the land quite well in the Smokies. And so I want to talk a little bit, we talked about what cemeteries we have, but I want to talk a little bit about the Enlow Slave Cemetery because it's the most important and accessible cemetery that we have. We've been lucky enough in the past few weeks to put wayside panels there for educating people. We've also brought out Yo-Yo Ma, a famous cellist that came out and did some music there. And we brought out Eric Mingus, an actual descendant of one of the people that could be possibly buried there. So we found out quite a bit. But the Conalucky Visitor Center area is known to be the land of the Enlows, Minguses, and Hydes as far back as the 1790s. So those were the original families that settled these areas. They were known enslavers. They actually had enslaved people from Florida all the way up to North Carolina. We know that through records. Their plantations wasn't large, as I said before, and usually their enslaved count would be maybe 8 to 10. What they would do with their enslaved during the winter months is actually send them to Asheville and Knoxville to work at hotels and things of that nature. So we've been able to trace that down as well. I'm sure a lot of you all have been to the mill, Mingus Mill, before. And a lot of times when people go to Mingus Mill, we only talk about the mill history, which is so cool, right? You have this working mill, not at the time, not right now. We're kind of working on it. But we have this mill that Dr. John Mingus rebuilt in 1886. Park Service did an iteration of it in the 1960s. We don't know exactly when the first mill was built, but the picture that you see behind me is of Mingus Mill, and it was a community spot. So you can imagine all of us taking our king corn or whatever we had to be, ground at the time. But then also, what do we do when we go to the grocery store? We talk, we gossip, especially after Sunday. We gossip and things such as that nature about the week's events. And for so long, we've told this story about Dr. John Mingus in the mill because it's been so important. But there's actually another story that goes with that. Here's a closer picture of the Enlow enslaved or slave cemetery here of the footstones. And the Enlows and Minguses actually own this cemetery. So their enslaved would have been buried here. There's also a family cemetery roughly about a half a mile away, which we think that some of the enslaved could have been buried there, but we can't really, we don't have enough records or research to say that's so. However, Dr. John Mingus, the Enlows, they all would have been put in there enslaved here over time. And when we started doing research on the Enlow Slave Cemetery, you walk up to it and you walk up to this open spot with these graves, and you look at the mounds and you wonder, why are those mounds there, and why are these troughs here, and what does it look like? So you'll see on the left, you're going to see Blair Tormey is a coastal research scientist at the Western Carolina University. One thing we do to study cemeteries without being intrusive is we actually use something called ground penetrating radar. And so the first thing we did back in about 2019, we worked with Asheville City Greenworks, which they bring different children, high school age youth out to kind of help with projects like this. We worked with Western Carolina University, and then we started doing our ground penetrating radar. Now, when I started here, I thought we only had 5 burials here. And we know that because of something called slave schedules, which we'll talk about in a second, census records and land deeds as well. And we said there has to be more because this cemetery has been used since 1790s, early 1800s. That's a long time, all the way until 1865 or maybe even longer. And so Blair comes out with this machine, and this machine runs over the burials, doesn't dip into them. And what it does is it sends radar waves down, and when it hits a void, it makes a picture. And that picture is what you're seeing on the right of the screen. And so if you look closely, you will see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 burials there. And so because of this technology, we went from 5 to 8, which is a big thing. We also knew that there were 5 enslaved people there because the records reflected that as far as the slave schedules. But now we can see what people were asking about earlier about why the mounds and the troughs. So if you look at the red lines there, you're going to see that the burials are actually between the mounds because they've moved over time. Now, the other thing that we learned from this as well is some of them are buried in caskets, pine caskets. We may even have a young 2 or 3 year old child there as well, all the way up to possibly, 50 years of age according to the records. And so we learned a little bit more that way. But then we kind of said there has to be a different way or methods to learn more about the burials here too. So they have something called these human detection or cadaver dogs that we brought in. And so just like CSI and the different movies that you all watch on the weekends, we actually brought in these cadaver dogs by Paul Martin Consultant, and they can smell human decomposition. And so they have a trained response to scent, like most dogs, and they will sniff, sit right there, and then we can actually bring the GPR out, run over that spot, and we can actually see if there's a burial there. And so because of these human detection dogs, there may be more than 8 burials at the Enlow Slave Cemetery that we never knew about. Also, if you think about the Smokies terrain, these are perfect. You can't take a 150-pound GPR machine through the mountains as easy as it's taking one of these human detection dogs. So again, they can smell a lot better than us. People have been using human detection or cadaver dogs since the 70s, and there's quite a lot of research on it. So that's our second method. So we're actually still doing this, and we're using this not only at this cemetery, but we're also using this at Ravensfort, which is in Cherokee, North Carolina. And we've been able to find, because of that, I think we found 18 burials where we thought there was only 3. So just a little bit about, we talked about the slave schedule. So how do we put this picture together? Now we've used the methodology of ground penetrating radar. We've used cadaver dogs or human detection dogs. Now we have to go back to the books and put this stuff together. So we use something called slave schedules. Slave schedules were census records of the enslaved from 1850s to 1860s. Is how the enslavers actually kept up with their chattel or their property, as they called it at the time. And so these are really important to our research. You can't see this quite on the screen here, but for every enslaver, say for instance, I'm just getting a little closer here. If you look, here's W.W. Enlow here, one of the enslavers and owners at the time. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marks here. And that is in representation of the enslaved people that he owned at the time. But what do you not notice, with census records, especially the slave schedule, what do you not see by these marks? Names. There's no names, right? So we got some ages here, 5, 12, male, female, you have black. Every so often you may see an M for mulatto or biracial. That's what they said back then. And so what happens when you don't have names or birth dates or pictures? How hard is that research when you're trying to figure out lineage of people? Is it easy? It's not at all. And so a lot of what we do is we can tell a higher or narrative, but we can't get to the meat of it. It's not like if you go to a cemetery today and you can read a whole passage about how someone was so great, even if there wasn't. But what we do know is that our important story of Dr. John Mingus and him owning not only land, but homes and being an enslaver in that area comes with another important story. And so when I got to the Smokies, I kept hearing about this story about a jazz musician. That's what it was. Every time, say, gosh, man, Charles Mingus, he's connected to this place. And it didn't matter if I was using the restroom, if I was eating my lunch, there'd be a visitor that came up and would say, do you know the Charles Mingus story? And as I'm using the restroom, no, I look over my shoulder, no. and then, eating my sandwich, the one time that, I don't have a napkin, it's all over my face. And I look over. Do you know Charles Mingus story? No, but do you have a napkin? and that was my life in the Smokies the first year and a half. So at the time, we worked with a Green and Youth Foundation, which is an internship foundation out of Atlanta. And we had a young lady that was awesome. Her name was Adelaide Dorfield. And her job was to really be the hound to sniff out this story. And so I said, well, we kind of know about this jazz musician named Charles Mingus. So we can start there. We kind of know a little bit about who was buried there. And then this name of Dan or Daniel Mingus started coming up. And we started seeing these records from the Asheville Citizen Times about this enslaved person by the name of Dan Mingus. And people kept talking about how important his craftsmanship was. He built all of these beds and he helped Dr. John Mingus build a home. Now, just remember that I said that. And we started looking at Daniel Mingus, and we know a little bit about him. Obviously, he was previously enslaved. We don't really know when he was born. We do know that he eventually, moved just outside of the Smokies at one time. We know that he was actually married to a white woman at one time and had children. And so we start looking into that. And then we also start looking into the story of Charles Mingus. We'll call him Senior, but his son. And we'll look into that a little bit more and talk about that a little more. And then that actually led us to Charles Mingus Jr., which is the jazz musician. So the puzzle starts coming together. And so the biggest part of this puzzle is this. So when we started learning about Dan or Daniel Mingus and looking at all these great articles about this man, we kind of put it together, and we started looking at the census records of Swain County. And what we found, my mic will go out a little bit here. So as we started looking, we're looking through this census record, and we see a Charles Mingus here that's either 3 or 5 years old here. We see a Clorinda Mingus. We see a John Mingus, or Dr. John Mingus as well. And we see a Daniel Mingus here. Okay, so Daniel's there. And you also see a Sarah here, which is the wife of Daniel Mingus and a child. So records are really important. So let's put this together. And what we found out is that this little guy here was born in 1877. Okay, now why is that important? Because in 1877, Dr. John Mingus was building a home in the Conaluftee area. Dr. John Mingus was building this home, and who was helping him was Daniel Mingus. His daughter, Clorinda, would have been in that home. Again, 1877 is when the child is born. 1877 is when the house was being built. So Dr. John Mingus or Daniel Mingus actually had a relationship with Clorinda Mingus, and they had this child. Now, what do you do with this biracial child in the Smokies in the 1800s, 1877? What would you do? You'll keep it? Okay, what would life be like? Life would be a little different, right? A little different. And so what we've discovered is this child actually lived. They did keep the child. Dr. John Mingus actually raised the child. Yeah. Clorinda Mingus actually remarried and left, and her white husband at the time didn't let her talk to the child again. So we found that out. And so when we were doing the research, we wondered why Charles Mingus Sr. came back to the Smokies after enlisting in the military when he was 16. He came back around 18 and he just left. And he never came back. When we were doing the oral history with Eric Mingus, obviously the descendant, he said, yeah, my dad, the jazz player, Charles Mingus, told me that, you know, what happened is he was disowned, his dad was disowned and never came back. So that's what happened there. And so now we kind of put this picture together, but there was something else that you might notice. So right here is the race. I don't know if some of you can see that, but these are W's. Do you notice a W by his name? So us being the detectives we are, we're just like, wow, how did that happen, right? And it's because Clorinda's dad, Abraham, actually was the census taker. He was the enumerator. See, y'all get this. When I talk to younger crowds, they never get that. So he's the enumerator. And so when you're in the enumerator, you go up to someone's home and you look at them, how you spell your name. A lot of times enumerators, you'll see in these records where the names are spelled incorrectly. That's because that's what the enumerator heard. But you also can look at the person and say, are they white? Are they black? Are they mulatto? Are they... But if you're the enumerator and a family member has a biracial kid, then what are you going to put on the census? They put white. And so this small W would really change Charles Mingus Sr.'s life. And I'll tell you how. So let's look at him. Look at that picture on the left. He's in the back squinting. He's like, I'm trying to make it. So you're looking at this picture of this young man here. This would have been when Charles Mingus, this military uniform, this is probably late 1890s, somewhere in there. And so when he went into the military at a young age, we think 16, 17, he was actually in an all-white regiment, actually. And as time went on, they actually this regiment found out that he was biracial. And he would switch over to a black regiment known as the Buffalo Soldiers later on. But it kind of messes up people's psyche too. I'm an anthropologist, so this is what I do. And when we were talking with Eric Mingus with the oral history, he said that his grandfather never would let his daughters date black men, even though he was half black. And I always bring this up because it makes people uncomfortable, but it's also just how the culture, how it shifted him. But at the same time, his grandfather would always say his dad was from Africa. And so when he was young, that enumerator, that W totally changed his life. But it changed his life for the good as well. As you can see, he was a Buffalo Soldier. He was in the Spanish-American War as well. And also he worked for the post office in Los Angeles before he passed away. During that time, he would have Charles Mingus Jr. Has anyone ever listened to his music before? A couple of people. Did you know it was connected before? A lot of people do not know. They've listened to Charles Mingus Jr. So Charles Mingus was born in 1922. And if you ever listen to his music, he's this double bassist pianist that really just tells stories. A lot of people didn't know that he was telling stories about Little Rock, Arkansas at the time. What was going on in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 50s, 60s. He talked a lot about that through his music, through his instrumentals. He also composed a lot of music. He composed about 350 songs with Kid Ory, Louis Armstrong, and so on. But again, he dealt with never really coming back to the Smokies and never feeling accepted because of his race. And so, just like his father, he would tell different stories and things such as that nature. But just like his father, he battled with being biracial. Eric Mingus told us a story about when they lived in New York City, Eric Mingus, his son, and they were walking down the road, and Eric Mingus is very fair-skinned as well and light eyes. And a police officer says, like, "Are you hurt? Like, is this your father?" And Charles Mingus says, "Yeah, this is my son." They go through the protocol and things like that. But it was the first time that Eric really saw that his life was a little different. And even as a kid, it made him think about the Smokies and Daniel Mingus and Charles Mingus, his grandfather. And he battled with being biracial as well. The thing about Charles Mingus that's really important is that when we were doing our research, we were really running into a lot of fables, saying, why are you lying so much? What's the point? And this is why oral histories are really important. His son says, well, I'll tell you why he lied so much. I should have put this recording in here. He said, back in the 1950s, 40s, when they lived in New York City, they had a lot of writers that would come and want to hear the story of Black America. Their story was different. It was playing dominoes, people getting into it, and they wanted him to tell that story. And so he got so tired of hearing this that he started telling lies. And even in the autobiography that he put together, Eric is rewriting it because there's so many lies in there, because he just got tired of, telling people that really living in the Bronx at the time or New York City at the time was sometimes very boring, where they just would go to Central Park and look at frogs and turtles. A lot of stuff that people do. But he also said that his dad was a complicated man that would, push people to greatness, but in not so nice ways. And even when his father passed away, what really pushed him to the brink was not necessarily the heart disease, but he couldn't play music anymore. He couldn't quite move. And he died in Mexico because he went to Mexico to see a shaman or to do a different kind of medicine. And so Eric says he never really departed from his father, because by the time, he's in New York, his father's in Mexico, they never had a ceremony. So if you ever look up Charles Mingus, he never had a funeral or anything when he passed. The other thing about him in his life is that when he was a famous jazz musician during the 1950s and 60s. And so Eric says that when he would go overseas and do shows in Europe and things like that, he knew his life was kind of different. So it's kind of tough to talk about social issues such as segregation or civil rights, because he could go into these places and play and make money. And so again, they had a complex life there, a complex man. But what we love in the Smokies is we are able to tell the real story of who he really was. As I said, the father that would walk to Central Park and talk to his child and push people to greatness. So we've been able to change that narrative. Now, one thing that in this, since we've been doing the project, is we met with some community leaders a couple of years ago when we were making our wayside panels, which are these educational signs that you see in the Smokies. And one of our community members said, there's not enough stories about women. Where are the stories about women? And, we looking back and forth, it's like, ugh. Yeah, there's not. I have to explain this before we get into Sook Turner's story, is that you have to think about, enslaved people was already invisible enough, especially the men. So if you think about women back at this time, they were even more invisible. The stories are a little bit more tougher to find. But what we did find is at the Meigs Mountain Cemetery, some very close to a place called Elkmont, as you all know, where you have Daisy Town and the beautiful historic homes that we've been preserving. Just down Jake's Creek is actually Meg's Mountain Cemetery, which Margaret Jane Turner or Sook Turner is born. Has anyone ever heard that name? Well, you have. What do you know about Sook Turner?
My son is a descendant of William Walker.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Didn't they have a child together?
That's what they say. Yeah, that's what they say. There was a lot of back and forth about, did they have a child together? And so we'll kind of talk a little bit about Sook and the story and the what ifs. But so we started really going down, not the rabbit hole, but on this adventure of trying to find more African-American women's stories. I will tell you that what really inspired us, we already wanted to create equity with these stories anyway, but what really inspired us is I get an email, now we're really telling stories pretty much, but I get an email from our archivist, Micah Day, and he says, I have this really cool footage you need to see. And there's this black and white footage in Elkmont of these African Americans working at some of the lodges. As you remember, some of Appalachian, clubhouse and things like that. Footage that we had never seen before. And footage that we'll be adding to our film that we're going to start working on this fall. And I said, okay, so there has to be hope. And so we started looking into Margaret Jane or Sook Turner, which was, we believe she came, or we know she came from census records from South Carolina. And we know she was previously enslaved. Her story is very close to the Mingus' story in that census records, she goes back and forth. So sometimes she's mulatto, sometimes she's black, sometimes she may be white throughout her history. But she did marry George W. Turner, as you know, and they did have children, John, Christopher, James, and George Turner. Sometimes we call him Geo. And they did live in the Smokies as a interracial couple for quite some time. Just to let you know, North Carolina and Tennessee during the time of enslavement and even during the time of Reconstruction was a lot different. During the time of enslavement, North Carolina would give incentives to bring in enslaved labor. And so you could get 7 acres of land and things like that. So North Carolina was very pro-slavery at the time. Tennessee was a little different. And so with Tennessee, you had abolitionists, the Quakers in these areas such as Knoxville or Maryville. And you also had in the Tennessee area, you would have people that fought against the Southern regimes or the South when the Civil War happened. So what we found is we've seen any kind of, for the most part, free people of color, because there was free people of color in the Smokies. They lived in like Cades Cove in the 1850s, places like that. And they did move. So there was an exodus around the 50s where black people moved out of the area. But we do know that there was free people of color in those areas. I like to bring up Sook Turner's story because the most important thing about her is not only her grave. When you go to Meg's Mountain, she actually has her name on that grave. The nickname Sook, to me, shows that in that community, she was somewhat known, probably respected. And the biggest thing, too, is not only was she a woman that was widowed by 1910, but she also was a farmer and she owned a home and land, which is really weird for women, period, in the early 1900s. And so we don't have any photos of Sook, but we were lucky enough to work with the University of Tennessee with a young artist by the name of Malia that made this photo. What we found the chimney of the home that he used to live in. So we do have that still in the park. But although we don't have a deep, intense story about Sook, it's really special to see how she made a life in the Smokies. This is a little bit closer of the Meigs Mountain Cemetery where Aunt Sook Turner is actually buried today. In the last two cemeteries I would like to talk about is the Kerr family cemetery. In the crowd, how many people has been to Cataloochee? Did you know it was a cemetery, an enslaved cemetery there? A lot of people don't. So we tackled the Kerr cemetery for quite some time. But when I took over the project, I wanted to go to this cemetery to really figure out who these people were. In 2019, the Southeastern Archaeological Center comes in, they bring in their, and that's with the Park Service, they bring in their ground penetrating radar, or GPR, up this huge steep hill. I mean, it's right up. And I've hiked it before. I don't want to hike it again, but for the research, I will. So we go straight up this hill and we're huffing and puffing. And they had done a GPR there previous to when I was there. And there was always stories about the Kerr cemetery about, previously enslaved people being there and that there were 4 burials there. And so my job is to investigate that. And so if you look at the records here, the first thing that I found in Cataloochee was this passage from the historian at the time about a Negro graveyard on Park Track number 227A, which is the Asbury Trail, which is not on our official trails anymore. So it's hard to find. And it mentions, as you can see, 1 white man and 7 Negro slaves on Asbury Trail about 300 yards east. And so we went up there, I think it was 2021, made my way up there with another ranger, and we said, okay, we're really not finding this. As far as the Kerr family, it's hard to find who these people were because in the census records, it was O.E. Kerr, A.O. Kerr, as you can see. And you can see that A.O. Kerr, there was enslaved people under him, 3 years old, 47, and so on. The story is kind of funny because it stops right there. Could not find any information. And there's a reason why we couldn't find any information. What we discovered is, well, let's tackle a couple of things first. So this is a little bit closer to the Kerr Cemetery here. As you can see on the right, if you're just walking past, you wouldn't be able to make out what that is, right? This on the left is the ground penetrating radar at Kerr Cemetery. And as you can see, 1, 2, 3, and a 4th grave there, buried away from the other graves. Okay, so a couple of things here. We're looking at this grave site. There's about 2 headstones up there now, so you don't have the 4 that coincides with what we've learned about. And but the ground penetrating radar, as you can tell, can actually, these circles tell what those burials are. These burials are kind of they're not really east to west. They're all over the place. And first we wanted to know, why is there 1 burial by itself? Who is that? So we kept looking through the records, and there's a reference in this 250-page document. It took me forever to read. That a reference of a white man that's buried in Cataloochee. And so no name or anything like that, but the reference states that this white man was hiking through Cataloochee. Cataloochee was actually, going back a little bit, was used by the Eastern Band of Cherokee as hunting lands. Cataloochee was actually at one time part of Buncombe County, or Asheville, and was separated. Cataloochee, for the Native American language, is actually talking about the mountains and finger trails that was created. So that's pretty much what it means. And this gentleman, a lot of people used to come in, and the way that Cataloochee was set up, you would parcel out land so you could rent land to bring your livestock. So this gentleman probably was coming to Cataloochee maybe running livestock, maybe to buy something. There was fishing lodges there as well. And when he passed away, they buried him up here in the enslaved cemetery. That's the one grave, grave number 4 that you see here, that's by itself, we think. So they didn't know his name. But what about the other 3? And so one thing I want to tell the crowd is that life for enslaved people was different in different parts of the park. So if you were in the Oconaluftee area, if you were enslaved, you would be dealing with the pigs, things like that. You would be selling those apple orchards if they were there, things such as that nature. In a place like Cataloochee, you would be working at the hunting and fishing lodges. You would be guides and things such as that nature. Apparently, from records, what we've been able to find is there was a black man by the name of Old Smart. His nickname was Old Smart. And he actually helped with horses in the area. So there's a possibility that Old Smart may be one of these grave sites. There's also reference to someone's cell phone. I'm just joking. There's also reference to a woman that could be buried there as well. And so the Kerr Cemetery, although not much there, we've been able to start building this story of thinking about Black people at the time, even after enslavement, actually still working this land. Now, the biggest thing is who was Kerr? Who was A.O. or E.O. Kerr? We found out the reason why this story is difficult is because we think he actually worked for someone in Cataloochee and he didn't own the land, but for some reason, they put him as owning these enslaved people. And so his story is not that deep. He probably came in and was an overseer at the time and just came in to make money and left from there. So the Cataloochee, what we're trying to do now is build a story for enslaved people. Our last site here is the Higdon Cemetery. Has anyone ever heard of it? Higdon Cemetery? So Higdon Cemetery is on our North Carolina side of the park. There's a huge Lake Fontana. You ever heard of that? And we have to use an actual boat to get to it. And so this one is pretty self-explanatory here. not that difficult, right? But it's an important story. So this is our last cemetery here. And when I started researching this with Western Carolina University, we're wondering why the stone, just a black man, tells us a little bit. But as we're doing our research, we kept hearing reference about a black man in the Higdon area around Fontana Dam. And I have not seen these oral histories, but I've been told that there's oral histories out there of people saying, yeah, there was this black man that used to come around the area. And this headstone really doesn't do him justice because what we found out is just these 3 words is important. So we don't know it. We know that we think he died around the 1920s. What was happening in Appalachia, 1920s, early 21, 22? There was an outbreak, influenza outbreak that was killing a lot of people at the time. He is referenced as being one of the people that would take medicine to the community. And actually, he died from the outbreak because he was doing that. We still don't know his name, even though he put his life on the line. And you think about when COVID just happened and we didn't know a lot, he would have been one of those doctors or those people actually there. We also know that someone in the Higdon family must have put this headstone there. But we don't know when, we don't know who, probably during some kind of decorations day or something like that. But the thing about it too, about his burial is we speculate that he was actually buried outside of the white cemetery. So he's a little bit outside. We think there was a fence there. So the sad thing is that even though he helped so many people, both black and white, he was still kind of buried in this manner. And so this story is important as we're still looking through it, because we do want to honor, this man, and hopefully one day we'll find his name. So, we've talked quite a bit today about cemeteries, and I've told you, why they're so important. I look at, this stone. I look at the field and headstones of people, and I just think about what would they say if they knew that the Smokies was on this endeavor today, that we were here to actually tell their stories. When I say we, not only park rangers, but actually community members. I look around today, over 50 people are here to hear this story. And some of you are going to share that story. And what can we learn from that? And when I was thinking about this program, out of all of the programs that I could have put together, I thought this was fitting for a place that's so vast, but so much knowledge to learn, so much to learn about the people. And the biggest thing for this program or project is this, that we are able to start creating equity among all of our people or our cultures in the Smokies. The African American Project was not started to just tell African American history. It was started so when people come into the park, such as you, that you can get a little bit of everything, whether that's Eastern Band of Cherokee or early settler history and now African American history. And so I always like to ask people, or just leave you with this non-open-ended question, when we all pass away, which it will happen, all dogs have their day, what would be on your tombstone? How will people remember you? 100 years ago, when some guy like me is researching that stone, what's the story that's going to be told? Because now, as you can see, it's so important, that story that's told, because we can share it with these future generations. And we're here today looking at some of these stones, not knowing too much, but because of the African American Experiences Project, we've been able to tell a whole 50 minutes, probably over time, of information that you all can actually hand down to future generations. So I want to thank you very much for having me today. I want to thank you for letting me drive 3 hours a day in your presence. And at this time, I just want to see if there's any questions or that someone may have from the crowd. And thank you at home.
What was the meaning of the coin on the great stone?
I forgot to talk about that. So what was the meaning of the coin? So I love to talk about, so you think about enslaved people being ripped away from their homelands, or you today. Well, I'll tell you this story. My mother-in-law she's from Germany. And one time when their home burned down, she said they took a pot that we have that's been in the family for a long time, 200 years, beautiful seasoned pot. And I think they took some dog food or something. It was very weird. And I bring that up because when you're ripped away from your home, you usually take random items. But what's in your mind, all of the memories and the fun times that you had and the culture that you have, those are the main things that you take. The items don't really matter, right? And so what we found out about the coins is that when enslaved Africans came to America, a lot of their culture was, they're Christians now, they're doing these things. Things have changed. The coins itself is a piece of Africa. And what that is that each time that someone dies, family members or friends will leave coins on the grave. The reason being is because they believed in the afterlife as handing over money for a toll to get in a boat and then going to their heaven. And so the coins that you see, we still have people doing that today. It's very similar to some of the stuff that the military does or some of the stuff that you see in Scotland. But they were able to keep those memories and that important custom. And so it's a beautiful thing to see that even before we were doing this project, there was 50, 60 coins sitting on those graves. Next question? Yeah, you.
So you mentioned the out-migration of black families,
Yep.
and so you have this disruption of families not being able to come back and take care of markers.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Park Service discovers a grave, what's the best practice for remarking that grave or putting up?
Well, that's what's difficult, because if we had, so in a perfect world, which we'll never do, just in case my boss is watching, we'll never do, is you could dig up a grave site and you could test it for DNA, the teeth, things like that. They do this even with mammoths, 50,000 years old. You can test that. But also you need a database. In Charleston, South Carolina, they're putting together this huge database of African Americans that live there, where people can actually find out who they were. See, one thing I didn't talk about is so with census records or slave schedules, you don't see much. What changed was the Civil War. So what happened in the Civil War was these black soldiers wanted their pensions. And they got their pensions, but what you would have to do, you would have to go to court and you would have to say, my child is Sally Wright, I'm married to Mary Wright, we met here, we did this, and you tell a whole story. And what Charleston, South Carolina, their museums have been able to do is take those stories, and you can look up, I think it's the Pensions Records Project. You can look up all kinds of stories of Black Americans. Here you don't have that. We would never dig up a grave anyway, but when you just have numbers and race, you can't figure out who's on the stone. Like I said, Dan or Daniel Mingus could be buried there. He did move away. Actually, no, he's not buried there. However, some of the Minguses could be buried there. However, we'll never know because of that. You know what I mean? Because we just don't have any names. Will we ever know? Probably not. And that's why this project is so important, just to tell the higher view of who the people were that could be buried there. That gives you no answers. I'm so sorry. Anyone else? Yeah.
The cemeteries that you focused on, does the park maintain the upkeep for those since they're located in the Smokies?
We do. And so he asked was the cemeteries that we talked about today or that maintain. We maintain them as best as possible. Like I said, there's close to 160 of them. We try to keep them on the same criteria. So what we have is a trail crew that's all they do is go on trails every day. And so they hike miles and miles a week, 20, 30 miles a week. And when they come across these cemeteries, they will cut the grass, do things like that. So maintaining is a little bit easier than you probably think. If you notice, those cemeteries were kind of, let's see if I can, see how open that is? See how like, you have all this moss and that's it, and then open trees. So that was intentional back in the Smokies, whether black or white or Cherokee. That's because they wanted to make sure that there were no snakes and stuff around the graves, because you get all the leaves and stuff. So what they would do is clear that land intentionally, and then they would build these cemeteries, and then the moss would grow. Most of our 99% are like that. And so we don't have to, something else kind of on another note, what's really cool about these cemeteries, you can kind of see the native flowers that used to grow at the time too, because they would use those native flowers to put on grave sites. I didn't talk about that much. And so also you're able to, if you're an ethnobotanist or something, you're able to look at look at those flowers and say, oh, they were growing persimmon trees back at that time. And so the most upkeep that they have to do is some of these get a little grassy. but we have a running list, and they try to do about 20 or 30 a year. For the most part, you don't have to do too much, though. Any more? Yeah.
Is your work on cemeteries phase one of the total project?
No, this is just a portion of it. And so we have many stories. We have stories when it comes to music. We have the Dr. Dennis Branch story as well. So, I mean, we have different stories that we tell according on the audience. And so we change those according on where we go or just how we feel. This year, we're focusing on Elkmont. And so there's a huge project in Elkmont. We have a lot of stories such as Sook Turner, the Davis family, and we'll be doing that. And there was also, the trains would come through Elkmont to see. So we're trying to see if like Black people came from different places, such as Knoxville, to work in those areas. So it's just according on where we want to go with the research. So the next will be Cataloochee and Elkmont are the stories that we'll tell. And as I was telling you all, the National Park Foundation actually awarded us money to make an Eastern Band of Cherokee film and an African American film. And I'm the project manager for the African American film, and we're supposed to start filming hopefully in September. And hopefully one of those names we'll have is Nikki Giovanni will be in that film. So we got a couple of different people that's going to be a part of that. And we have other projects too. Who are you going to?
Have you ever used dowsing or witching once you find a grave site to find additional graves?
No, explain that to me.
It's like when you're witching for a well.
Oh, yeah.
They used to use witch hazel or something,
Yeah.
but you find a specific type stick.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in the Appalachian community who still do that. We have to talk to our family.
Yeah. I've heard of it. We haven't used it.
It's a backup.
Yeah, it's a backup. Can you imagine me getting up here like that? Yeah. It's no, we haven't, but we try to use methodologies that's been backed up with research, and we try to use as much old and new technology that we can to find. Honestly, most of the time people stumble upon these sites, the newer ones. The one we didn't talk about was Ravensford in in Cherokee. That site with the 18 or more enslaved burials, that was one of those sites where we just started doing the research on it. It was always talked about, but now we're doing the research on it, and it looks a lot like this one behind me. And so that was one of those where it was like hearsay, and then we actually went up there and we're like, oh, it is a cemetery, and then we just went through records that people kept talking about. There were enslaved people buried up there. The one Ravensford we didn't talk about. Any more? Yeah.
Yes, we have a question on Zoom.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And Ms. Dockery is the president of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society.
Perfect.
And they have been working on identifying unmarked graves.
Yeah.
And wondering if you've had any contact with them. I know Art Bohannon and others are helping in their projects, like in Sevier County and in different areas. Didn't know if you had a chance to work with them or were aware of their work.
No, I haven't. However, for you at home, if you ever send me an email, sometimes it goes to the spam. So always send it again. I haven't worked with them, but it would be good to kind of make that connection.
I have her contact, so I think it would be a really good, if they would like to know what you're doing and vice versa.
Yeah, we're always open to build more partnerships and capacity. And so, we would love to work with you. Just reach out. Go to www.nps.gov/GRSM. And that's where you can go to the African American Experience page, and those emails usually go to me. So please reach out. Any more? Yeah.
Are there guides that would take you up to these cemeteries, or do you need to be an experienced hiker?
Okay. So for some of these, like the Higdon, you have to have a boat. So Park Service runs a ferry twice a year that goes out there. The Cataloochee one, it's pretty tough. It's straight up. That's why we have so much research on the enslaved cemetery one, because you can go see that. If you go over the Mingus Mill, you'll see a parking lot bathroom area, and just to behind, like if you just look right behind you, you'll see a wayside panel sign about this tall, and it'll tell you can go up. That's our most accessible one, but usually a lot. So the hard thing about these cemeteries is that what they would do is they would build them on these knolls or these hills. And the reason being is because they wanted the cemeteries to be closer to God. And so that's why they built them that way. And so some of these cemeteries go pretty far up, as far up as they can go. And so we even think with the Cherokee one, the Ravensford Cemetery, they might have used a horse and buggy or a horse to take the bodies up, because it's pretty tough to get up there. So if you want to see any of these cemeteries, I would go to Enloe by the Econo-Lefty Visitor Center. Yeah.
One last one.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
This will be our last one.
Sure.
The worst
Yeah.
one of all.
Yeah.
Headstone versus footstone.
Yes. So same type of stone. One thing I didn't talk about is that if someone in the Smokies had a cross saw, they could make a nice pretty stone out of this different type of stone that they had. Headstone is just at the top of the grave, footstone is at the foot of the grave. So they use both as markers.
Why one or the other, head or foot? Is that significant?
It's not significant. It's just what they did. It just marked like the beginning and the end of the burial. There's no real significance to it. In rare cases, they would get stones shipped from Asheville, say on a train, if they wanted to make some of these nice marble stones that you see. But that was very rare, a very rare case. Most family members would make that stone or find those stones, and that was pretty much it. I mean, so it was no real significance there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, everyone. I can get used to this setup. It feels like you're a president or something. I can get used to this. Again, thank you everyone for coming. I'll be around for a couple of minutes just to answer a couple of questions. As long as I get home for dinner and my wife don't get mad, we'll be good to go.